As the Puritan colonies in New England became more and more established, you start to see a steady stream of Puritan emigration from England and Puritans coming to North America and coming to New England and establishing themselves there. One of the larger groups was a group that was led by this man named John Winthrop, who you see here, who founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630. This was the largest group of around 1,000, and their goal was to found the city on a hill. And this idea of a city on a hill, the city of the godly, we've seen this in numerous efforts to implement Calvinism. We see it in Geneva, we've seen it with the Anabaptists. And Winthrop is trying to do the same thing, but this rhetoric of a city on a hill became an important part of rhetoric about the new nation of America. The new nation of America would be a city on a hill. Within this colony, literacy was encouraged, seen as a way of learning more about God by learning the Bible. And in 1636, so only 6 years after this colony had been founded, only 15 years after the first Puritans arrived in New England, Harford College was founded as a center, a seminary essentially for training Puritan ministers. And by 1640, the Puritan colonies in New England had reached 20,000 inhabitants. This is right at the time when the English Civil War breaks out. The English Civil War changes the dynamics of English immigration to North America. That's because now the Puritans are in control in England during the reign of Oliver Cromwell, that there's no longer a need to leave England. And so you have a slower Puritan immigration into New England, but at the same time you have increased immigration into Virginia. That's because Virginia remains Anglican, remains sympathetic to the Royalists, remains sympathetic to Charles I and Charles II. Although it's theoretically part of the Commonwealth ruled by Oliver Cromwell, they're so far away, it's so difficult to enforce anything that Virginia becomes a common place of refuge for those who are trying to escape from Puritan rule and come to North America. During this period, the American colonies become more independent. We've already seen that there's a culture of independence in these colonies from the very beginning anyway. And what we find as the English Civil War is going on, during the reign of Oliver Cromwell, back to the transition to Charles II, it takes a long time to communicate and to enforce all these changes that are happening, and the colonies get more and more used to governing themselves. With the restoration of the monarchy under Charles II, English expansion in North America continues. Now, the English capture New York from the Dutch in 1664 as part of the war against the Dutch, which is basically a war for who's going to dominate trade. And they settle the Carolinas, North and South Carolina, in 1669. Carolina comes from the Latin for Charles, and so these new colonies are named in honor of Charles II. And so by the time we get to 1670, the English control almost the entire Atlantic coast of North America. The English colonies continue to expand despite, at least in New England, their strict Protestant observance, their strict Puritan observance. And we're going to continue to focus on New England for the rest of this class material. What's different about New England is that the colonists come as family groups. They didn't come, let's say, as miners or coffee plantation growers in the way the Spanish had towards the south. They didn't come as tobacco farmers in the way that the Virginians did. They came as family units in order to set up a separate society. And so there's much less intermingling with the native groups. So with the Spanish in what becomes Mexico and in Central America, you have a lot of intermarrying between Spanish settlers and Native Americans, and that doesn't happen in New England. The colonists remain pretty distinct and separate from the Native Americans. They do translate the Bible for the Algonquin tribe into their language, but as far as we can tell, relatively few conversions took place. And the Algonquins initially saw the colonists as helpful allies against their rivals, the Pequot. And in 1637, the Puritan settlers fought with the Algonquin against the Pequot, who were trying to expand into southern New England. And the Puritans defeated them, but then horrified their allies by some of the massacres of the defeated Pequot that they carried out. And so this war established the Puritan settlers as a powerful force in the region. And from this point onwards, they're increasingly independent. They're much less reliant on their Native American allies. Remember, in the beginning, they relied on these local groups in order to survive. That changes basically around the time of the Pequot War. This is a large and powerful group in the region now. The Puritans were strict Calvinists, and Calvinism was strictly enforced in these colonies. Church attendance was mandatory, subject to a fine, and the church was patrolled by a man with a stick. And so one end of the stick had a knob on the end of it to discipline children who were misbehaving. The other end had a feather to tickle adults who had fallen asleep. Leave it up to you to decide which you'd rather have. Certain crimes were publicly punished. Adulterers were forced to wear a scarlet letter A, and so this is where the term scarlet letter comes from. Those who apostatized were publicly hung. Committing blasphemy was a capital crime. Later in 1690s, the witch craze would come to Massachusetts with the witch trials of Salem, when 20 women, including teenagers, were hung. Those who dissented from the governing authorities in these colonies were banished. Anne Hutchinson was one of these. She argued, and this is the difficult dynamic for Calvinism, she argued that the Calvinists were focusing far too much on works and were not focusing enough on faith. She claimed the authority to read the Bible herself. She said this was exactly what the original Protestant reformers had claimed, but doing so in this context got her into trouble with the leaders of the colony. Another dissenter was Roger Williams, who questioned the land that the Puritans had seized from the colonists. He was banished for this, and he ended up founding the colony of Rhode Island, where he promoted a more vigorous separation of church and state. So whereas these early Puritan colonies in Plymouth and Boston, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, whereas these are very much theocracies on the Calvinist model, Rhode Island and a later colony, Harford Colony, these emphasize separation of church and state. So when Thomas Hooker founds the Harford Colony, you no longer have to be a member of the official church of the colony in order to be a citizen, and that had been a requirement in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The Harford Colony is also famous as the place where the first North American Constitution was written and approved. So this Constitution elected a governor of the colony and a two-house legislature. I don't want you to think that this is some kind of progression from theocratic colonies to colonies that promote a separation of church and state. The theocratic colonies were very much continued. So the New Haven colony that was founded by John Davenport in 1637 is perhaps the most theocratic colony of them all. It even abolished trial by jury because John Davenport said we can't find any evidence of this in the Bible, and crimes were simply judged by magistrates. We know there were judges in the Bible, but we don't know that there were juries. In 1662, Charles II would combine these two colonies, the New Haven colony and the Harford colony, to form the colony of Connecticut in 1662. And at this point, you have the origins of most of the 13 colonies. So we can see that when we think about the ongoing history of America that I'm not going to cover in this class, we can see that there remains a distinction and a debate between the extent to which these are going to be theocratic colonies or colonies governed on a theocratic model, and colonies that are going to follow more of an Enlightenment model that separates the church and state. But That's a narrative and a story for another class.